The Further Education of OverSoul 7 by Jane Roberts, read by Martin John. Chapter 13. Between Ages. Lydia meets Tweety and an old love. Lydia sat in her trailer, glowering. The ocean at her doorstep sparkled in the sunlight. A few palm trees were visible in the distance. She was drinking coffee, and she smelled the aroma. She was gloriously, triumphantly young, having chosen to be 23 after hours of changing back and forth, studying the subtle differences between each age from 20 to 30. She was inspired enough. At least she'd been writing poetry. The scene, her own image, everything was perfect. The epitome of everything she'd always wanted. But she wasn't happy. Who'd read her poetry, for one thing? She was lonely, between worlds. She felt dissatisfied with herself, as if she were still wanting a certain kind of understanding, as if she were really only half aware of the realities about her. Now and then she sensed vast activity all around her, but beyond her reach or perception. Yet to be born again seemed to demand more courage than she possessed, she thought, and her pilgrimage to the gods was dependent upon Seven's help. Without him, she seemed to get nowhere in her search, and Seven had disappeared once again. She suspected that he was letting her stew in her own juices. She had sons and a daughter still living, but it was difficult to understand that now, Lydia thought. They seemed like storybook people. That was because she related better to poetry and to the natural world than she did to her own family. It had always been hard for her to take people seriously. "You'd better hurry up," a child's voice said. "What?" Lydia stared out of the trailer window, seeing no one at first. In the next moment, a small child was visible at the horizon, yet moving toward Lydia with impossible speed. Before Lydia got over her surprise, wondering how she'd heard the voice when the child was so far away, she noticed something else. This was a little girl wearing a snowsuit. The beach dunes glittered. Then the child was in front of her. "You'd really better hurry," she said reproachfully. She was pudgy, with wide, earnest, light blue eyes and a firm jaw, although her face otherwise was round enough. "I'd better hurry for what?" Lydia asked. "You're not the only person in the universe, you know," the little girl answered, again reproachfully. "What's your name, and what do you want? And for heaven's sakes, why are you wearing a snowsuit?" "I want to go home now," the little girl said soberly. "You better come back now, too." Lydia started to reply, but she stopped considering. The little girl was about 6 years old, and she looked very familiar and very foreign or exotic or something at once. "Come on," the child said gravely. Yet at the same time, there was also a note in her clear, high voice. "You're coming, aren't you?" "I have to go back," she said. "And if you don't come, I don't know what will happen." "Tweety, Tweety," came still another voice. "I'm here," the little girl called back, and Lydia stared. Tweety, her own future self, provided she was reborn, of course. But how could the child be Tweety when she hadn't been born yet? "Just who are you?" she cried angrily. She was almost tempted to shake the little girl's shoulders when another child, a boy, also in a snow attire, suddenly appeared in the distance. He was about 8 years old, puffing, out of breath. "It's supper time. Where have you been? You'll get a licking if you don't hurry." He paused, seeing Lydia, and asked uneasily, "Who is that?" He stared. Lydia stared back. It was Lawrence. It was. "Don't you dare tell him," cried Tweety. As Lydia stepped back in astonishment, she noticed the farmhouse for the first time, and suddenly realized that for the entire interview the bright sand had been transforming itself gradually, granules turning to packed snow, sunlight darkening until now it was twilight with blue shadows covering the winter landscape. She looked around anxiously for her trailer, for the sun. The little boy asked again, "Who is that lady?" and she forgot everything else, as buried memories from her last life suddenly were reclaimed. She and Lawrence as young people in isolated scenes. She and Lawrence, old and stubborn, defying the establishment. And this little boy was Lawrence. She knew it. What then? Lawrence born again. How could she have forgotten him? And what else had she forgotten? And why? "The little boy is my cousin," Tweety said gently to Lydia, speaking too meaningfully for a child. Lydia just kept staring. The boy's eyes, as he stared back, were so innocent and guileless and clear, and so ignorant of her, that Lydia wanted to cry. But already the boy had turned, made a snowball in his snow-caked mittens, and ran to the farmhouse. The back door opened, a slice of light illuminating the dark barnyard. Tweety said, "I have to go. You have to come." And she, too, ran toward the farm. Lydia gasped and moved automatically toward the house, drawn by Tweety, but more toward the memory of Lawrence. How was it that the children had found her to begin with? Why didn't the boy know he was Lawrence and recognize her? Why? The children had disappeared inside the house, and moving closer to it, Lydia gasped again. How could she have forgotten her love of Lawrence, she wondered, more desperately than she had ever before? Because now, all at once, and in a rush, Lydia's full memory and feeling returned full blast, richer than anything she could imagine, more important than the meaning of life or finding the gods. The feelings roused. What? Desire for life, whether or not she understood it. At the same time, she peered through the windows of the house. They were iced over on the outside and steamed over on the inside. So she chipped off some small patches of ice in order to see more clearly. What she saw filled her with the oddest nostalgia. The family was gathered at the table in the dining room, bright in fireplace light and further lit by 2 fat candles. On the thick wooden table sat a gigantic platter of smoked fish, along with loaves of brown crusty bread to which Joseph was helping himself. Elgren Hosentoff sat at the head of the table with his eldest son, Jonathan, while Elgren's wife, Hovana, bustled back and forth. The 2 children slyly eyed each other. They only had soup, no fish, and Bianca, Tweety's mother, grown stout, was saying, "Lars goes home tomorrow. His parents are coming for him, and that's that." Tweety mumbled under her breath, and the boy, Lars, lowered his head. Lydia was almost crying. Lawrence would be called Lars then, and be her cousin. That is she was born as Tweety. She yearned to tell the small boy, to make him understand. Mentally she cried, "Oh, don't you remember? We were lovers. You died on our trailer trip together." "I'm a grown-up man, really," Lars said, puffing out his chest for Tweety's benefit. "Children do not speak at dinner," Old Man Hosentoff thundered. "I am too grown up," Lars boasted, gesturing wildly and spilling his soup. Tweety giggled and ducked to avoid the heel of bread thrown by her grandfather. It landed in her mother's soup instead, splashing, and everybody laughed. "You'll just get him in trouble, and Tweety too," said a terribly familiar voice. Lydia spun around. There stood Lawrence, exactly as she remembered him, in his late 20s, as he'd been when they first met. "I couldn't talk to you until you wanted to remember," Lawrence said. He didn't look at her, though, but stared through the window. "Fascinating, isn't it, to see ourselves as we'll be?" he asked. "Forget them." "We're us," Lydia cried. "You mean you remembered me? How could I have forgotten you? I'll never know." He wore a black opera cape and carried a fresh bouquet of roses that flashed against the snow as the window light fell against the ground. "Oh, Lawrence, Larry," she exclaimed, and for a moment she felt that they were still having their early affair, and she was still married to Roger. "You were married to Roger," Lawrence said. "But I'm not married now," Lydia cried. "And we're young again. Are we? Or are we just between ages?" Lawrence asked, smiling. He handed her the flowers and said, "What will you do with them?" "Put them in a vase on a living room table? Don't you understand? We're ageless. But to be really young, we have to go back in time. We have to be born again." "We can stay just as we are," she said. "You'll like it less and less," he answered. We really don't know enough yet to stay here without physical lives. There's more too. You've been living in your mental world. Even I couldn't get your notice earlier. But he broke off, embarrassed, worried for her and ill at ease for himself. He knew the look in her eyes too well, and she was growing more desirable and lovely by the minute. I have this lovely little hallucinatory trailer by the ocean, she said, shrugging her shoulders, raising those arched black brows with exaggerated, humorous, but quite effective invitation. Lydia, for God's sake, listen, he said. Look in that window. Look at that child, Tweety. She exists in a certain reality, one that may or may not take place. The same applies to Lars. Doesn't that mean anything to you? You were easier to get along with when we were alive, she said, glaring at him. Besides, I'm being born as Tweety in the past, at least from our point of view. So, somehow, Tweety was born, no matter what I decide now. I've already figured that out. You're wrong, Lawrence said anxiously. All the time is at once. There isn't really any past or future, so... But her anger had taken her away where his love couldn't reach. She vanished, along with the farmhouse and the landscape, and Lawrence knew that he had to try and find her again as quickly as he could. To Lydia, Lawrence had vanished. Larry? Where did you go? She cried. Right beside her, he asked the same question of her, but neither one saw or heard the other, and each of them felt disconsolate. Lydia the most, because her memories of Lawrence kept swirling around her, vivid scenes appearing and disappearing. It was inconceivable, she thought for the 10th time, that she'd forgotten him. But he'd obviously returned because of their love, and to help her, perhaps to warn her. But about what? And again, if she'd forgotten Lawrence, what else had she forgotten, and why? Then, seemingly for no reason, she remembered the voices and presences she sensed about at various times, the images that almost but not quite materialized, the voices that almost spoke. She'd often suspected that she was surrounded by an entire different dimension of actuality. For one thing, the sounds were too fast for her to follow, and the images that she felt would change too quickly for her to perceive them. She realized that she had the same sensations now, of straining to hear or see some indefinable activity. She sensed motion of a kind, replete with people, a world that somehow existed right now, beyond her grasp, but a world into which she was trying to materialize. But what kind of world? And who was there? Would she find Lawrence there too? And as soon as she thought of Lawrence, the name Roger came to mind. And she thought, of course, Roger was my husband. but somehow that didn't seem to be the right answer. Yet the name kept ringing in her mind until she could think of nothing else. And all about her, images began to waver and wobble and form. In Chapter 13, Peace, Light, and Love. Aloha.